The night Deacon Sharp decides to confess, the world feels deceptively quiet, as though even fate itself is holding its breath. He sits alone for a long time before he speaks, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the soft creak of wood, the distant hum of a city that never truly sleeps. He tells himself that honesty is the last virtue left to him, that whatever remains of his integrity depends on saying the words he has avoided for too long. He believes that confession might be painful, even explosive, but he does not imagine that it will be fatal. In his mind, truth is still something that leads to consequences, not endings. Deacon has never been good at living in halves. When he loves recklessly. When he commits, he does so with a desperation born of a lifetime spent trying to outrun his own failures. His marriage to Sheila began as an act of defiance as much as devotion, a declaration that he could choose someone the world refused to forgive and still stand upright. Sheila, to him, was not merely a pariah, she was a mirror of his own exile. Loving her felt like choosing the side of the condemned, and for a time, that choice gave him a sense of purpose. They were outsiders together, bound not by approval but by survival. Yet survival is not the same as peace, and Deacon has begun to feel the difference acutely. Somewhere along the way, his heart slipped its moorings, drifting towards something quieter, something that did not demand constant vigilance. Taylor entered his life not as temptation, but as gravity. She listened without flinching, believed without bargaining, and in doing so exposed a hunger in Deacon he did not know he carried. The hunger was not for romance alone, but for absolution without spectacle. Loving Taylor, even silently, felt like breathing air that did not burn. That is why the confession matters to him. He cannot continue pretending that his marriage is intact when it has already fractured from the inside. He cannot keep offering Sheila loyalty while his heart has begun to belong elsewhere. The name Taylor has become, in his mind, a crack he cannot plaster over, a truth that makes every other lie intolerable. Deacon believes that naming this truth, however painful, is the only way to prevent further damage. He does not want to betray Sheila through secrecy. He wants to leave her with honesty, believing that honesty is the least cruel exit. Sheila hears more than he intends her to hear. She stands in the shadows, unseen, as Deacon's words reach her not as a confession of weakness, but as a declaration of strategy. What strikes her is not the admission of emotional drift, but the clarity with which he speaks of departure. This is not a momentary lapse, not a fleeting infatuation that can be outweighted or outmaneuvered. This is an escape plan. Taylor's name is not a temptation. It is an exit sign. And Sheila understands instantly what that means for her. For Sheila, the marriage was never just love. It was legitimacy. It was the closest thing she had ever had to being accepted, to standing in the light rather than lurking at its edges. Deacon was her proof that redemption was possible, that someone could choose her not in spite of her past, but with full knowledge of it. Through him, she could believe that she belonged somewhere, that she was anchored in a world that had always tried to push her out. Losing Deacon is not merely losing a husband. It is losing the last argument she has ever had against the verdict of society. She does not confront him immediately. Sheila has never been impulsive when patience serves her better. Instead, she watches, listens, and recalibrates. The softness she had allowed herself to show becomes a liability, so she reshapes it into a weapon. When Deacon finally speaks to her openly, trying to frame his confession as remorse rather than rejection, Sheila meets him with an expression that suggests forgiveness, even understanding. She tells him that marriages bend, that hearts wander, that reconciliation is not only possible but necessary. She invites him into a night that looks, on the surface, like a truce. The tragedy is that Deacon believes her. He has spent too long underestimating how deeply Sheila understands fear, how intimately she knows the architecture of loss. In that moment, when she offers tenderness instead of rage, he mistakes restraint for acceptance. He believes that perhaps he can ease away gently, that perhaps she will survive without him. He does not see that her calm is not peace, but preparation. The night unfolds with a careful intimacy, the kind that suggests resolution rather than escalation. Sheila listens as Deacon speaks of guilt, of confusion, of his desire not to hurt anyone more than he already has. She touches his hand at the right moments, nods when he speaks of responsibility, mirrors his language of regret. To an outsider, it would look like a marriage salvaged through honesty. To Sheila, it is the final audition before erasure. Because when Deacon leaves, he takes more than love with him. He takes the story that allowed Sheila to exist without apology. Without him, she returns to being a woman defined solely by her crimes, her obsessions, her violence. The world will not mourn her loss. It will celebrate it. Sheila understands this with brutal clarity. And she also understands that there is one thing the world will not question: an accident. When the moment comes, it is almost anticlimactic. There is no dramatic argument, no raised voices to alert fate. There is only timing, a misplaced step, a surface made just slick enough, a fraction of hesitation engineered into a space where gravity does the rest. Deacon's fall is swift, shocking, and irreversible. By the time anyone understands what has happened, it is already too late to ask why. The narrative forms quickly, efficiently. A tragic slip, a man distracted by emotion, an unfortunate end to a complicated life. Sheila plays her role perfectly, her grief raw enough to deflect suspicion, her shock convincing enough to silence questions. She becomes the widow no one quite knows how to comfort. The woman tragedy seems to follow like a curse rather than a choice. In death, Deacon is forgiven by any who never forgave him in life. In survival, Sheila is left with nothing but the echo of what she has done. Because the truth Sheila cannot escape is this: even though she has prevented abandonment, she has not preserved belonging. Deacon's death does not secure her place in the world. It erases the only person who ever offered it. The marriage she once clung to as proof of her humanity becomes, overnight, a reminder of her isolation. She is no longer a wife fighting for love. She is a woman alone with a secret so heavy it distorts every breath she takes. Grief, for Sheila, is not clean. It is layered with rage, regret, and an unbearable sense of displacement. She tells herself she had no choice, that survival demanded decisive action. Yet, in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, the truth seeps in: by killing Deacon, she has not won. She has only delayed the reckoning. The world still wants her gone, and now even the one person who tethered her to it is beyond reach. As the days pass, Sheila feels the absence of Deacon not as relief, but as vertigo. Without him, she has no script to follow, no role that grants her temporary immunity. People look at her with a familiar mixture of suspicion and contempt, and there is no husband beside her to soften their judgment. She has secured control in the most final way possible, but control without connection is a hollow victory. The cruelest irony is that Deacon's death accomplishes what his confession could not. It frees his heart entirely. In memory, he becomes gentle, conflict-ed, human. His feelings for Taylor are no longer a betrayal. They are a footnote in a story cut short. And Sheila, who sought to erase his departure, instead immortalizes it. In the end, Sheila does not simply lose a husband. She loses the last illusion that love could save her. The anchor she clung to is gone, and the sea she has always feared stretches endlessly in every direction. For the first time, there is no one left to blame, no partnership to justify her choices. There is only the unbearable knowledge that in trying to avoid being cast out, she has ensured her own isolation. And somewhere in that silence, deeper than guilt and sharper than grief, Sheila begins to understand the truth she has spent her life outrunning. Survival without redemption is not freedom. It is exile by another name. Sheila had always known what it meant to stand on the edge of a family and look inward, to feel the warmth of belonging close enough to touch yet forever out of reach. Long before Deacon's death, long before whispers turned into accusations and grief hardened into performance, Sheila lived with the constant awareness that she was tolerated rather than embraced. In the world Deacon tried to rebuild around his children, she was an afterthought at best and a threat at worst, a woman whose past followed her like a shadow no amount of good behavior could erase. Every dinner felt provisional, every smile conditional, every invitation laced with the unspoken understanding that she did not truly belong. At first, Sheila told herself that endurance was enough. She believed that if she stayed long enough, if she softened her edges and swallowed her pride, the family would eventually accept her. Deacon's children, Hope and Deke, had never hidden their discomfort. They were polite, measured, careful with their words, but Sheila could hear what lay beneath the surface: fear, distrust, resentment. They spoke of boundaries and forgiveness, of moving forward without dwelling on the past, yet every glance reminded her that her past was all they saw. Deacon, in his earnest determination to make things work, assured her that time would heal those wounds. Sheila wanted desperately to believe him. What she did not anticipate was how profoundly isolating that waiting would become. Every moment of exclusion sharpened her awareness that Deacon's love, however genuine, did not translate into acceptance. She was his wife, yes, but she was not woven into the fabric of his family. She remained an attachment rather than a foundation, a choice he defended rather than a reality others embraced. That distinction gnawed at her, feeding the old, familiar terror of being disposable. The realization that Deacon's emotional center was drifting toward Taylor did not arrive as a sudden shock. It crept in slowly through changes Sheila sensed before she could articulate them. Deacon became quieter, more reflective, less reactive to Sheila's moods. He spoke about therapy with a reverence that unsettled her, framing Taylor not as a professional obligation, but as a source of clarity. At first, Sheila dismissed her unease as insecurity, a residue of her own history, whispering threats where none existed. But insecurity sharpened into certainty the longer she watched him. Sheila understood, with painful precision, what was happening. Deacon's gratitude toward Taylor was being sanctified by the language of healing, masked as progress and self-improvement. Therapy became a shield, protecting emotions that would have otherwise been condemned. Love, or something dangerously close to it, was hiding behind clinical vocabulary and moral justification. Taylor represented everything Sheila could never be: respectable, forgiven, welcomed. The idea that Deacon's heart might be drifting toward her was not just a betrayal. It was a confirmation of Sheila's worst fear that no matter how hard she tried, she would always be replaceable by someone safer. By the time Deacon considered confessing, Sheila had already reached her conclusion. His words, once overheard, did not sound like a man seeking resolution. They sounded like a man preparing his exit. Taylor's name was not spoken with guilt alone, but with longing and inevitability. Sheila realized then that this was not about jealousy in the conventional sense. This was about erasure. Deacon was preparing to step into a future where Sheila did not exist, a future in which her presence would be reduced to a regrettable chapter he survived. For a woman whose entire life had been defined by rejection, this was not something to endure quietly. Sheila had spent decades being denied legitimacy by families, institutions, and society itself. She had learned early that rules were written to exclude her, that redemption was a privilege reserved for others. Deacon's marriage offered her a fragile foothold in a world that otherwise refused her entry. Losing that marriage meant losing the last argument she had against permanent exile. It was not merely the loss of a husband, it was the collapse of the only structure that allowed her to stand upright. In that context, Deacon's death was not an act of passion, but of defiance. Sheila did not see it as murder born of jealousy, she saw it as a final assertion of agency. If the family would never open the door to her, she would ensure no one else walked through it either. Blood, to Sheila, was not just violence, it was punctuation. It ended a sentence she had been struggling to complete her entire life. By closing the door in the most irrevocable way possible, she denied everyone else the future they had been quietly planning without her. What followed was performance, perfected through years of survival. Sheila stepped into the role of grieving widow with an ease that unsettled even her. She knew how to cry at the right moments, how to speak of Deacon with reverence and sorrow, how to frame her loss in a way that discouraged scrutiny. She became the embodiment of tragedy rather than its architect. In public, she was subdued, reflective, almost fragile. In private, she compartmentalized what she had done, telling herself that necessity absolved her of guilt. Hope and Deke were drawn into this performance against their will. Deacon's death struck them with a complexity of emotion they were not prepared to navigate. Grief collided with regret, love tangled with guilt. They remembered every argument, every moment they had questioned their father's choices, every time they had wished his marriage away. Now those wishes felt monstrous, as though their disapproval had somehow contributed to his end. Sheila's grief, so visible and raw, amplified their self-reproach. They began to wonder whether their resistance had pushed Deacon further into isolation, whether their inability to accept Sheila had forced him into choices that ultimately destroyed him. Sheila did nothing to dispel that guilt. She never accused them directly, never spoke a harsh word. Instead, she embodied forgiveness so thoroughly that it became suffocating. She spoke of Deacon's love for his children, of how deeply their opinions mattered to him, of how torn he had been trying to make everyone happy. Each word was chosen carefully, designed to reinforce the idea that Deacon had died under the weight of impossible expectations. Hope and Deke, already grieving, absorbed that implication until it became self-blame. The cruel brilliance of Sheila's strategy lay in its subtlety. She did not demand acceptance. She earned it through loss. She did not force herself into the family. She became unavoidable through tragedy. As a widow, she occupied a moral high ground she had never been granted as a wife. To question her now felt indecent, even cruel. Her presence, once resented, became something the family felt obligated to protect, as though caring for her was a way to atone for failing Deacon in life. Yet beneath the surface, Sheila's victory was hollow. The acceptance she gained was rooted in pity rather than love, obligation rather than trust. She had closed the door, yes, but in doing so, she trapped herself inside a narrative defined entirely by death. The family's guilt-bound compassion did not grant her belonging, it merely postponed her reckoning. She remained an outsider, now bound to them by loss instead of marriage. Hope, in her quieter moments, began to sense the imbalance. Grief gave way to unease as patterns emerged that did not align with the story Sheila presented. The perfection of her sorrow felt rehearsed, her composure controlled. Deke, more guarded by nature, noticed it too, though he struggled to articulate his discomfort without feeling disloyal to his father's memory. Both children found themselves caught between suspicion and shame, unsure whether their doubts were insight or cruelty. Sheila watched them closely, attuned to every shift in their behavior. She knew guilt was a fragile bond, easily broken if handled too roughly. She adjusted her performance accordingly, offering space when necessary, vulnerability when useful. She never overplayed her hand. Years of being underestimated had taught her patience. She understood that survival did not require constant action, only careful timing. In the end, Sheila achieved what she had always wanted but never truly understood. She ensured that Deacon's family could never move forward without her shadow looming over them. His death became the axis around which their relationships rotated, and Sheila stood at its center, both victim and architect. She had not entered the family through love or acceptance. She had fused herself into its history through trauma. But even as she held that power, Sheila felt its cost. The anchor she destroyed had been the only thing tethering her to something resembling normalcy. Without Deacon, she was once again a woman defined by absence, by the spaces she occupied only because no one knew how to remove her. She had slammed the door shut with blood, but on the other side of that door, there was no warmth waiting, only silence and the echo of her own choices. In the quiet aftermath, as Hope and Deke struggled to reconcile their grief with their growing doubts, Sheila remained vigilant. She understood better than anyone that guilt does not last forever. It erodes, questions surface, and truth has a way of seeping through even the most carefully constructed lies. For now, she wore her widowhood-like armor, knowing that as long as Deacon's memory remained sacred, she would be protected. Yet somewhere beneath that armor, Sheila felt the familiar tremor of instability return. She had closed the door to the family's future, but she had not opened one for herself. The world still wanted her gone, and without Deacon, she had no shield against that judgment. She had won the battle she believed necessary for survival, but the war against her own exile was far from over.